For the first standard of our bone unit, we're going to be classifying bones based on their shape, as well as talking about some of the microscopic features of bone tissue. The standard reads, I can classify bones according to their shape, composition, and function, and we've entered section 7.1 of our textbook. All right, a fresh, clean page in your notes. Unit 4 is all about the structure of the skeletal system. This is the only system that I've split into two distinct units. So we'll talk more about how the bones are organized and how they interact in our joints in Unit 5. Unit 4 focuses on what would we see under the microscope and what are the hallmarks of skeletal tissue. So the skeletal system composed of bone tissue, but also cartilage, dense connective tissue. It is where our blood is created, and there's even some nervous tissue in there. A synonym for bone is osseous tissue, so you may hear me use that term, and we'll see that root a lot. You maybe have heard it in osteoporosis, but osseous tissue just refers to bone. All right, and there are four primary functions of skeletal tissue. The first two are pretty obvious. We need to support and protect all of our soft underlying tissues. So our ribs protect our lungs and heart. Our spine holds our back up. So bones are the skeletal structure of our body. They also serve as attachment points for muscles. We'll learn specific terms for the bulged ends of most of our long bones, and those are designed perfectly to attach to our skeletal muscles so that we can move. We also produce all of our blood within our bones, and we store inorganic salts. So calcium and other minerals are kept in our bones, and if we need them, if we're having a shortage in our diet for whatever reason, we can break our own bones down and utilize those inorganic salts. Okay, subheading. Bone.1. First, we're classifying bones by shape, and there are four main categories, but there's kind of a fifth one lodged into one of the primary. So, your classic bone, right? If you think about bones that we give to dogs, or if you were going to dig up a bone, you'd probably picture a long bone. These are really narrow in the middle, and they have characteristic expanded ends. Again, these ends here are for attachment of muscles. So if this is a femur or a leg bone, which is exactly what it is, there's going to be a whole bunch of muscle sitting right here in between those two ends. So examples, most of your limbs are comprised of long bones. You have upper arm, upper leg, lower leg. These are all long bones. Short bones are about as long as they are wide, so we describe them as sort of cube-like. They don't have to be squarish, so bone B here is a short bone, but they have to just be roughly the same length and width. A lot of the bones that make up your hands, not your fingers, but like your hands, your wrist, your ankles, these are going to be short bones. And that fifth category, letter E here, a sesamoid bone is more roundish. So your kneecaps have a really nice round shape to them, and so we call that a sesamoid, but it is a type of short bone. Flat bones are more for protection, so they're plate-like with these really broad surfaces. Your skull is comprised of a series of flat bones that are all sort of like grown into each other and connected a few months after birth. And you also have some flat bones in your back, like on your shoulder blade. Your chest bone is a flat bone. You have a few others. Lastly, anything that doesn't fall into one of those major categories is considered an irregular bone. So bone D here is one of your vertebrae, one of your spinal bones, and it doesn't really fit any of our three other categories, so we would just call that irregular. All right, new subheading. We need to have terms for each of these different pieces of bone. So this is a photo. If you haven't drawn like these other bones in your notes, I would definitely draw and label and even color code this picture of a dissected long bone, because all of these are terms you'll have to be familiar with. I've color coded my terms, so maybe as you define them, you could draw them in that color. Okay, epiphyses are those expanded ends. It ends in IS if we're just talking about one of them, but bones typically have two epiphyses. There's a proximal one, which is usually closer to the point of attachment. So this is the end that's going to go into our hip. And then a distal epiphysis, which is farther away from the attachment site. So this would go up against our knee. In the middle of the bone shaft is referred to as the diaphysis. You only have one because it's just the middle. It's in between those two epiphyses. And then there's like a transition region. If you're not quite in that skinny diaphysis, but you're also not in that very formed epiphysis, we call that region of crossover the metaphysis. Okay, articular cartilage covers our epiphyses because this is where your bone is going to line up against another bone. And so we need something in there to lubricate and to make sure that our bones aren't grinding against one another. And so articular cartilage is the specific type of fibrocartilage or hyaline that covers the ends of our bones. Similarly, for protection, all around the outside of the bone, there is a layer called the periosteum. It's made of dense connective tissue, and here it's shown being like peeled away. It is meant to be protective and supportive. There are two kinds of bone. There's compact bone and spongy bone. Compact being stronger, not having a lot of space in between, being very solid. And spongy having all of these little holes in there, looking very much like the features of a sponge. We'll find compact bone mostly in the diaphysis, in the wall, and then we'll find spongy bone kind of all over. It'll be in the epiphyses, it'll be lining this middle cavity we see here in the diaphysis. Spongy bone is all over, but you can definitely notice a layer of compact on the outside. That hollow chamber I was talking about is called the medullary cavity, and it contains a lot of our living tissues. So arteries, veins, bone marrow. This is where our blood is created. We have red bone marrow that's creating blood, and we have yellow bone marrow that is storing some fat. But there is a lot of very living tissue in the medullary cavity. The endosteum is like the periosteum, but for the medullary cavity, it's a protective lining that sits inside here. And then lastly, bone marrow, like I mentioned, was either red or yellow, and it sits either in the medullary cavity or within the spongy bone spaces. Those spaces allow for a little bit of flexibility in your bones so that they don't shatter upon impact, and they also host red bone marrow so that you can produce blood throughout the entirety of your bone. A couple more vocab terms regarding the microscopic structure of a bone. A singular bone cell is called an osteocyte. That's once it's mature, it is a living cell, and it's usually surrounded by calcium or inorganic salts. It's sitting in a little hole. That hole that it sits in is called lacuna. Lacunae is when you have multiple of them, but it's just the hollowed out little area that the osteocyte can sit in. The matrix is what we call all of that non-living bone tissue. It has a little bit of collagen to keep it bouncy, but most of it is comprised of salts, primarily calcium, to keep its strength. Lastly, if these cells were just sitting in a carved out chamber without any sort of connections to other cells, they would not have the ability to transport nutrients or communicate with other cells, and so they would die very quickly. And so canaliculi are these tiny passageways that osteocytes use to shuttle oxygen, carbon dioxide, water in between one another. Here's a transverse cut of a long bone. So we can see that medullary cavity in the middle where there's a big hole. We have layers of spongy bone surrounded by then layers of compact bone. Compact bone, if we were to look really close in the microscope, we would see those cylindrical tree rings that we called osteons. So that is one unit of compact bone. It is the bone that is strong and solid. It bears all of our weight. It's the reason we can jump up and down and not have just fragile shatters all throughout our body. So it gives us that strength. There are layers of matrix around the central canal of each osteon, and those are called lamella. We will do some work in the lab to look at a better image of an osteon. Spongy bone, on the other hand, is just very thin branches of osseous tissue surrounding these really gaping cavities. The little branches that you see are called trabeculae, this word right here. So that's the name of the branches of spongy bone. Spongy bone is somewhat flexible, and like I said, it allows for bone marrow to exist in the center of the bone to produce blood. Your case study for this unit is covered in the first standard, and you'll be looking at osteoporosis, a bone disease in which the spaces of the spongy bone become larger and larger, and there are a few populations that are more at risk for osteoporosis than others, and so we'll be learning a little bit more about the disease and how to treat it.